It is truly astounding how much games have grown as of the last decades. It has gone from a niche hobby to something that the majority of people experience in some way, be it playing themselves or watching someone else play. And games have only gotten more accessible with the rise of mobile games, now allowing almost anyone to play games with their friends. With games becoming a part of the mainstream, discussions of games as an art form have also steadily increased. More people today see games not only as a way to simply pass time, but as works of art that bring out emotions not unlike a good book or movie. But in this discussion, a vital piece of the experience is often not included. Video game music is rarely discussed as often as visuals, gameplay, or story outside of small circles filled with die-hard fans. Of course, there are some pieces of music, like the Mario theme, that are known by almost anyone, but other than those juggernauts, it's still pretty niched. However, I believe that music is just as important to games as the aforementioned factors, and thus I think this lack of analysis is really unfortunate. Video game music is such a unique format to express emotions. This uniqueness is worthy of analysis. An analysis about how games and its music collaborate. Games are interactive. You play them. This is not any news, but it poses a problem for those who create their music. If you compare this to film music, a similar format, you can see a huge contrast. In movies, since it's predetermined when everything happens on a timeline, it allows the composers to create music which can be easily timed perfectly to visual cues. This makes it possible for the music to be extremely dynamic with huge highs and lows. However, unlike movies, games can't do this the same way due to the interactivity, since it's the player's split-second decisions that decides the outcome, not a script. At least outside of cutscenes. This leads to most composers just creating a track without as big highs and lows as film music and letting it play on repeat, and it not being affected by gameplay at all. Mind you, this is not a terrible solution to this problem. Most really iconic video game songs follow this format and it doesn't lessen their impact at all. It's just not particularly creative. A very common solution to this conundrum is to do a track that repeats, but still letting it have an intro that is not included in this loop. Take Aquatic Ambience from the Donkey Kong Country official soundtrack, for example. David Wise composed this song to have an A section and a B section. The ambient, mellow A section plays before the B section introduces percussion and a main melody. But when the B section ends, instead of starting from the beginning of the A section, it jumps to the beginning of the B section. This makes it so the piece is still slightly dynamic, with its slow being at the beginning of the track, and thus only being played once. Another, but completely different way of handling this issue can be seen in the Animal Crossing franchise. There, the music most often loops a single track, but it's still dependent on player input, that being when the player plays the game. Animal Crossing has a different track for each hour of the day, which is automatically transitioned to when that hour is reached. This makes it so, while the music doesn't directly correspond to the player's actions, it does correspond to the time of the day the player chooses to play the game. However, if the music is actually effective in portraying the feel of each hour is up to debate. Something else to add is how there is a track if it's raining in-game, which, while not being connected to player control, still connects the game world and the music. This connection is further legitimized in later games where there is an alternate version of each hour's song for when it's raining. This concept of music changing in time with events in-game has a name, adaptive music. One of the most spoken of examples of adaptive music is iMuse. I feel like every video on adaptive music mentions iMuse in Monkey Island 2, so I'll keep this brief. Michael Land, one of the composers for The Secret of Monkey Island, set out to create an audio engine which had adaptivity at its core. The end result, iMuse, also known as the Interactive Music Streaming Engine, can clearly be heard in Monkey Island 2. In the game, there are different themes for different areas which transition seamlessly to each other with transitional pieces. This makes it so changing from different tracks feels more fluid, since the music isn't interrupted by typical transitions and thus fits the game format very well. So, adaptive music is cool, but does it really serve a purpose? Because it certainly isn't effortless on part of the developers and composers to create some of these examples. Quite the opposite, in fact. This adaptivity may just sound like a thing that is added into games because the developers can, but in some cases, it can have a tangible effect on gameplay. When playing a game, a lot of information has to be conveyed to the player. Most developers do this via visual cues, such as pop-ups or text, but some developers do this via music. Take the Splatoon series, for example. In a series cluttered with information that the player might have a hard time picking up, some things are conveyed musically. First of all, when the player is submerged in ink, meaning the player is hidden from view from other players, there is a low-pass filter put on top of the music. In addition, in the game mode Tower Control, there plays a unique jingle when the player is on top of the tower. There is a jingle for both when your team and the opposing team is on the tower. And the volume is dependent on how close the player is to the tower. This addition both conveys if the objective is being pushed, which team is pushing it, as well as the player's proximity to the tower, which tells the player if they should be on offense or defense. Small things like this add to player awareness, which undoubtedly improves the experience of playing this fast-paced shooter, where having knowledge of what's happening in-game is the difference between victory and defeat. Time to introduce new concepts. In adaptive music, there are two major ways for the music to change in accordance with in-game events: horizontal resequencing and vertical reorchestration. Horizontal resequencing is when different tracks transition into each other. An example of this is the previously mentioned Monkey Island 2, which had this in mind during development. To further explain this concept, you can visualize it in a DAW. There is a track which transitions into another track when something happens in-game. The two tracks are displayed horizontally to each other, and hence the name horizontal resequencing. The other method, vertical reorchestration, is slightly different. Instead of the music completely changing, there are further elements added or subtracted to the music while the bass track still plays. An example of this is in Mario Kart. When the player has a substantial lead, there is an additional drum track added on top of the music, which conveys to the player that they might be target to more attacks than usual, as well as simply giving the player an adrenaline rush. Returning to the DAW example, you can visualize this as different tracks being added on top of each other. This is displayed in a DAW vertically, and hence gets the name vertical reorchestration. Why I brought up these examples is that they both have their own strengths when it comes to adaptivity and conveying information to the player. Horizontal resequencing is apt when big changes happen in-game, because the sudden change between different tracks is very noticeable and bold. Take the Great Ace Attorney, where during the Dance of Deduction minigames, the music changes when the titular and great detective presents his theories. And when the player character corrects his mistakes.
Yes!
A quite triumphant action. This change of music is accompanied by distinct sound effects to further legitimize this change of mood. Vertical reorchestration, however, is better when it comes to smaller changes in the game world. Changes based on small player inputs where complete changes in music would be too abrupt. In Portal 2, during the puzzles, the music gets minor flourishes when the player, for example, redirects lasers. In puzzle games like the Portal series, the player's influence on the game world is vital to solving the puzzles, and thus, feedback in the music interlinked with the game world fits especially well. Adaptive music in games doesn't only contribute to the gameplay, it can also strengthen the emotional beats that the game tries to convey. In most of the Fire Emblem series, like for example Fire Emblem Sacred Stones, there is a differing map and battle theme, which transitions quite abruptly when entering or leaving battle. However, starting with Fire Emblem Awakening, the composer started employing a different technique, where there is a map theme and a battle theme based on the same composition. These tracks play simultaneously, but only the appropriate theme is heard by the player. The result is a very dynamic and vertical approach on battle music. When it comes to the moods of the theme, there is a pattern. The map music is calm and methodical, while the battle theme is more energetic. There is, however, an exception. In A Funeral of Flowers, the theme that plays during the final boss in one of the routes of Fire Emblem Three Houses. The map theme is an orchestral, bombastic, melodramatic piece. But when entering the battle phase, it instead switches to a solemn piano piece. The context of the story when this plays, without delving into spoiler territory, is that you have to fight someone you really don't want to fight. And thus, having the battle theme being so sad sounding really establishes just that feeling, that the battle itself is unwanted. Another way to portray emotion is to make use of silence. Take the Minecraft soundtrack. In a game that many players spend an exorbitant amount of time on, the music could have become incredibly grating to listen to. The solution that the developers at Mojang and C418 came up with was to make it so the individual songs don't loop and instead are placed within multiple minutes of silence. The effect of this is that many of the songs don't get repetitive since you don't hear them on repeat. Another boon of this is that the silence itself increases the impact of the music in question. When trekking through the terrifying night, seeing the sun rise at the same time as one of the ethereal songs on the soundtrack starts playing, it really gives you shivers, way more than if the music was constantly playing. So, in all of these examples, the composers have different methods in order to adapt music to the game which is played. And I think this adaptivity is such an understated way of making the game dynamic. A hurdle that game developers have to go over is making the player feel like they have an impact in the game world, and having the player's actions control the music really goes a long way in doing this. Because that's what's so beautiful about game music, having the music bend and morph in tune with the player controlling their character. It is entirely unique to the game format and adds so much to the immersion. Movie music is often likened to game music, but there is a distinct difference. In movies, the music adapts to what happens on screen and to what the main character does. In games, conversely, you are the main character. If this video might have a reason for existing other to inform, it is to encourage. Encourage future game developers to be creative with the music to their games. While the examples previously mentioned are interesting, they are still a minority. The vast majority of games, even if they are really cinematic, still use a very simple system with looping music during gameplay. This lack of creativity, while understandable considering the amount of work it takes to create adaptive music, still detracts from what makes games unique. We are in a time where games become more and more influenced by the movie industry. While this makes games more accessible for the general public, it also makes games less unique from other art forms. Why not embrace what makes games special, adaptability? Why not make games feel like games? Because like previously mentioned, games are stories with the audience in the spotlight, but that spotlight is fickle. If games become too cinematic, it will rob the player of this agency, and player control, including control over the music, is necessary to maintain it. So please, future game developers, when creating your game, have in mind how games and its music collaborates.